Good evening. I'm Shireen Tairkeli, and a proud member of this team that's put together the Condoleezza Rice Women Who Inspire lecture series. Some of you may know the lecture series was started about a year and a half ago with some extraordinarily inspiring women leaders. We had the dedication today with Secretary Rice here and Ana Palacio, former ambassador of Spain, as the keynote speaker. We are very, very fortunate in that the first lecture in the renamed series is being, the lecture conversation is organized for this afternoon with Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson. Welcome. But before, there are just one or two small housekeeping rules, but before we get going, I really want to thank Dean Wali Nasser, Dean of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, for his leadership and support of this series at its inception, throughout, and into the future. So thank you, Wali. Really, really would not have worked without you. And we have an excellent team at SAIS that brings it all together. Some of you have dealt with members of the team, including Gabi, who's executive assistant to the dean. So thank you for that. This is an extraordinary chance to listen to one of America's foremost military leaders at a very critical time. It's always a critical time in America. It's always a critical time for the military. But I think right now, as we move forward in this century, the issues are different, and how one handles them is going to be, I think, something that you will learn about from the Secretary. I just want to say, please, if you have instruments that are like to buzz, hum, sing, please could you silence them, because we don't want to interrupt the flow of this conversation. I just want to introduce both Secretary Wilson and Ambassador Barrett, who will be the person in conversation with the Secretary. Both of these individuals are inspiring and hold to our mold, very much so. So I'm grateful for both of them being here today. Heather Wilson is the 24th Secretary of the Air Force and is responsible for the affairs of the Department of the Air Force, including the organizing, training, and equipping and providing for the welfare of 685,000 active duty, Guard, Reserve, and civilian forces, as well as their families. Before assuming her current position, Wilson was president of the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology and Engineering and Science Research University, of note. From 1998 to 2009, she was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, where she served on the House Armed Services Committee, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Before being elected to Congress, she was a cabinet secretary in New Mexico's state government, responsible for foster care, adoption, juvenile delinquency, children's mental health, and early childhood education. From 1989 to 1991, Secretary Wilson served at the National Security Council as Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control for President George H.W. Bush during the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. Secretary Wilson was an Air Force officer from 1982 to 89. She graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy in the third class to include women, and earned her master's and doctorate degree as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University in England. Ambassador Barbara Barrett was, until January 2009, the U.S. Ambassador to Finland. Prior to Finland, she served on the corporate boards of Raytheon, Exponent, and the Mayo Clinic, and was a trustee of Aerospace Corporation and the Thunderbird School of Global Management. She was chairman of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy and a member of the Smithsonian National Board, Space Foundation Board, Horatio Alger Association Board, Defense Business Board, and Senior Advisory Board at Harvard's Institute of Politics. Earlier, Ambassador Barrett was a senior advisor to the U.S. mission at the UN and president and CEO of the American Management Association, both in New York City. She was Valley Bank of Arizona's founding chairman and taught leadership as a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She was also the deputy administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. It's a personal favorite of mine, Barbara. I had to mention it. Partner in a large Phoenix law firm, vice chairman of the U.S. Civil Aeronautics Board, and executive officer of 2 Fortune 500 corporations. She earned her bachelor degrees, master's, and law degrees at Arizona State University. Honorary doctorates have been conferred by ASU, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, Thunderbird, and the University of South Carolina. She has been recognized with the Horatio Alger Award, Woodrow Wilson Award for Corporate Citizenship, and Sandra Day O'Connor Board Excellence Award from the American Bar Association. In addition to all of these, she also knows how to fly an F-16. So Finland has F-16s, and I'm told Barbara flew them in for Finland. So that's very cool. And she trained in the space program as a backup for going to the space station. So, I mean, she's amazing as well. So we have the pleasure this afternoon of hearing from 2 extraordinary and inspiring women leaders. I thank you both very much. Madam Secretary, if you don't mind coming up here for your remarks, and then we can go to the conversation part.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to spend a little bit of time with all of you this afternoon. I can't think of a better person to have named this lecture series after than Condoleezza Rice, and I'm so pleased to see SAIS, Johns Hopkins SAIS, do that on her behalf. I thought I would mention a few things, and then Ambassador Barrett and I will have a chance to just sit down and have a conversation and answer questions and so forth. And I thought I'd talk about a few things that are going on in the Air Force, and then we can just kind of open it up to whatever people want to talk about. Last January, so January a year ago, then Secretary Mattis promulgated a new national defense strategy, which explicitly recognized the reemergence of great power competition as really the defining problem of our time as people who are concerned with the security of the United States. We are in a situation where we have a potential adversary that is innovating faster than we are. And in addition to this national defense strategy that was promulgated, there was an independent commission to review that strategy, commissioned by the Congress. And that commission concluded that regardless of where the next conflict occurs or which adversary it features, the Air Force will be in the forefront. The missions that we have as a Defense Department all involve air power at the forefront. We have to protect the homeland. There are 14 aircraft on 5-minute alert at 7 bases around the country 24/7, so that if there is ever a threat to this country, they scramble and meet that threat. We protect the homeland. That is our sacred and first obligation. Second, we maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent, and we have done since the end of the Second World War. 2 of the legs of the triad are operated and maintained by the United States Air Force, the air leg and the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And 3/4 of nuclear command, control, and communication are also operated by the United States Air Force. We also are charged with deterring and, if necessary, defeating a near-peer adversary while we deter a rogue state. So, for sizing constructs in the past, there was often this construct of 2 major wars. The defense strategy says to us we need to deter and defeat a near-peer adversary while we deter a rogue state who might take advantage of the fact that we are engaged with a near peer. And do all of these things while managing violent extremism at lower levels of effort. Those are the tasks laid out in the National Defense Strategy. All 5 of them involve the United States Air Force in air and in space. And that is the challenge that's been put in front of us. You know, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Dave Goldfein, is fond of saying, you know, sometimes he feels like he's at a recovery meeting. He stands up and he says, you know, hi, my name is Dave Goldfein, and my problem is that I've been engaged in fighting in the Middle East against violent extremism for 27 straight years. Dave Goldfein, so when I was on the National Security Council staff and Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Dave Goldfein was a captain and the United States Air Force went to war. The United States Air Force has been continuously involved in combat operations since that time. At the time, we had 401 operational squadrons, and we used those squadrons to devastate a non-nuclear mid-tier or power. Today, the United States Air Force has 312 operational squadrons and is significantly smaller in terms of numbers of people. The United States Air Force is too small for what the nation is asking us to do. We have to restore the readiness of the force and increase the size of the force to create the Air Force we need to meet the needs of the National Defense Strategy. So there is the need to grow and change the way we fight over the next 10 to 15 years. But we also have some other things that we've been doing and I think are important from a leadership point of view. The Secretary of the Air Force is responsible for organizing, training, and equipping the force and presenting those ready forces to a combatant commander who has Army, Navy, and Air Force forces under them to fight. We don't fight. We organize, train, and equip the forces. That means that one of the biggest parts of what we do is equip those forces, is to develop and buy equipment. We have an adversary that is innovating faster than we are. And we have an acquisition system that was designed for the Cold War. That has to change. And so the Air Force is embracing new authorities that have been given to us by the Congress to buy things faster and smarter. That means prototyping and experimentation. We've been given the authority to prototype things and experiment to get capability from the lab bench to the warfighter faster. Just as a couple of examples, we are experimenting with adaptive engines. We took the 2 of the largest engine manufacturers and we said we didn't do a long analysis of alternatives and take 2.5 years to come up with requirements. What we said was we generally want to try to get a 10% increase in thrust and a 25% increase in fuel efficiency. We gave it to 2 companies who were very competitive with each other and said, see what you can build. And they're moving forward with those adaptive engines. We are tailoring our acquisition strategies, stripping out time. 11 months ago, we gave a challenge to our acquisition community in the Air Force. We said, let's see if we can strip out 100 years out of our acquisition programs in 12 months. Go. We are now at 78.5 years taken out of our acquisition schedules, not by shortchanging things, but instead of just buying the suit off the rack and doing everything the same way every time, we're tailoring every suit to what that program needs. We also believe that competition works. We've had 4 major procurements in the last 6 months. The TX new trainer, the replacement for the UH-1 helicopter, the next generation GPS satellite, and launch services. So we don't build rockets anymore, we buy launches. In those 4 procurements alone, because of intense competition, we saved $15 billion over what our cost estimates projected the cost would be. Competition works to benefit the taxpayer and get capability to the warfighter. But that wasn't enough. We also know that to engage America's most innovative companies, we have to be willing to meet small business where they are. And small business, is almost like we go to Remember you go to those rides like in Orlando or at Disney World or something, and there's that sign that says must be this high to ride the ride? We want to take down the sign and make it easy for innovative small businesses to do work with the United States Air Force. We have $660 million in our budget every year in something called Small Business Innovative Research. And there's another similar program on technology transfer. But we were taking 180 days on average to do the contracting. 180 days for a small business is forever. So he said, cut down the time. They got to about 90 days using the same way in which we used to do it, and we said that's still not good enough. So we gave them a challenge. We said, see if you can get a one-page contract that can be signed in one day with a progress payment on the same day, which required people to completely change the way they were thinking about contracting with small business. And then in New York, we tried it. We called it Pitch Day. And we asked small companies or universities, and we put it out on LinkedIn and Google. We didn't put it in the Federal Register, which no innovative business looks at anyway. And we said, here are some problems. Give us your ideas, no longer than 5 pages in a pitch deck. We got over 400 small businesses that gave us ideas on solving problems, and we invited about 60 of them to New York for a day. They pitched directly to the users and the program managers and to the venture capital and prime contractors that were there with us. And on that day, we signed almost 60 contracts with small business. One-page contract, average time to complete the contract was 15 minutes. And we swiped the government credit card for progress payments on that day, which meant a small business didn't have to go find somebody at a bank to give them a loan to be able to do business with the Air Force. Thank goodness for a guy named Scott at Bank of America who was on the phone with us almost all day. Because if you swipe a government credit card for $3.75 million in 60 increments, it triggers every fraud and money laundering statute in America. But he believed, no, this is legit. It's the United States Air Force. We're just paying with credit card. What that really does is change the paradigm. We want the United States Air Force to be the customer of the customer of choice for America's most innovative companies. So we're going to do it again. And the next pitch day will be some of our most difficult space programs and problems that we'll do this fall in Los Angeles. With respect to space, we are accelerating defendable space because the world has changed. The United States Air Force operates about 90% of what's in space for the Defense Department, but is now a contested domain. The United States is the best in the world at space, and our adversaries know it. And they're seeking to develop the capabilities to deny us the use of space in crisis or war. And we have to recognize that and develop the ability to defend our space systems on orbit. That has meant considerable increases in the defense budget and changes in the programs that we have there, and changes in the organization and the way in which we're buying space systems. All of that is moving forward. The final thing I would highlight is we just released and announced our new science and technology strategy, updated science and technology strategy for the Air Force. The Air Force has been doing science and technology strategies about every 7 to 10 years since its creation. This is a little bit different in that it says that it doesn't just list a list of technologies that we're going to research. It says that we must master speed, time, and complexity, and that we have some strategic capabilities where we should focus our research. Global persistent awareness. Right now, we take pictures of every point on the Earth about twice a day. What happens when it's 5 times a second? That becomes global persistent awareness. How do you manage that data and get information from that data that is actionable? Resilient information sharing. It's no longer about the platforms that we fly. It is about the ability to share and connect information among them faster than an adversary. rapid, effective decision-making. So instead of going to a phone book, as many of you in this room don't even know what a phone book is and have never seen one, to look in the yellow pages for Chinese restaurants on where you might call or pull out a map to look at, as I would have done when I was your age as a young person working in this city. You all pull out your phones and look on Yelp and see what the reviews are, and then you call an Uber and it takes you there. That is rapid, effective decision-making because you got information that was harder to get in another way. We do the same thing for the military. Complexity, unpredictability, and mass. We need to think about how do we get to targets rapidly and overwhelm an adversary faster than they can think about what is even going on. And finally, speed and reach of disruption and lethality. The United States Air Force has always been principally responsible for projecting power globally at a moment's notice. And those moments are getting closer together. And we have to drive the technology to be able to do that far into the future. That science and technology strategy, I think long-term, combined with some other changes we're doing in personnel, will have the ability to change and transform the Air Force into the Air Force we need for the future. And with that, maybe Ambassador Barrett and I will yik-yak and answer some questions.
Let's see, first of all, a mic test. Can you hear me? All right, great. Well, pretty good, huh? I think that's pretty comforting to hear. You know, I'm of a generation when women who would inspire, there were three basic opportunities for what women could do. They could be a teacher, a secretary, or a nurse. Today's women who inspire are often secretaries, but this isn't the kind of secretary that we were thinking at the time.
You'll appreciate this. So my daughter, who's 23, sometimes it's hard to be the daughter of a member of Congress. And she's a very independent, headstrong young woman. I don't know where she gets that from. But she always, when anyone asks her, well, what does your mom do? She said, well, she works for the federal government. And then they say, well, what does she do? She says, she's a secretary. And that just ends the conversation.
But I don't think the image people get is the secretary that you are.
I know.
So as women who inspire, you've inspired in many ways. But one of the ways that I'd like to ask you about is to think about what is the legacy that you would envision for. You've announced your intention to move on, to go back to academia, whence you came. And as you head back there and you think about your time, your years here as Secretary of the Air Force, what do you anticipate that legacy to be?
Well, we've certainly started to restore the readiness of the force to win any fight, any time. And that really matters. I think the other thing is empowering airmen. Now, the Chief of Staff and I have an approach that says, you know, centralized mission direction and decentralized execution. Let's stop telling airmen how to do everything and tell them what to do, and then let them surprise us with their ingenuity. Airmen, culturally and in their DNA, we're a bunch of bicycle mechanics. And we need to empower airmen to do those things. One of the things we've done, and it's kind of boring, but the airmen get it, and why it matters, is I have a pile of regulations we've rescinded in the Air Force. We've rescinded I think it's now over 330 regulations that prescribe everything from how to hang someone. We actually had somebody sent it to me, it's amazing. We had an Air Force regulation on how to build an obstacle course. It was mandatory. My guess is if they need to build an obstacle course at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, they can figure it out. No?
Right.
So we just rescinded them. So I'm up to 75 pounds and about 4.5 feet of rescinded regulations. And all of that is about empowering airmen to get after the mission, because the future of warfare will not have exquisite command and control. It'll have disrupted command and control. And you'll have to give airmen mission direction and trust them to use their training and their judgment to accomplish the mission. And if we expect that of them in wartime, we have to treat them that way in peacetime.
So we're going to have a chance to have, I'll get an opportunity for for 3 or 4 questions maybe, and then we're going to open it to your questions. So I wanted to just give you that advance warning so you start thinking about the questions you're going to want to ask. You mentioned space, and space is such an important topic and important to all of us. We have what's going on, the small sats that China is putting together. There's a lot of conversation in Washington especially today about infrastructure. When we thought of infrastructure in the 50s or 60s, we'd think about bridges and roads and culverts. In today's world, the infrastructural item that everyone uses before they have their first coffee in the morning is space assets. But you mentioned the competitive and vulnerable environment that they now operate in. What can we look forward to in space, and how are we going to fix some of those? You talked about it briefly, but can you give us a bit more of the granularity?
I mean, we do take space for granted. Every one of you who looks at a blue dot on your phone, that blue dot is provided by a squadron of 40 airmen outside of Colorado Springs, Colorado, who operate GPS for the world. So 1 billion people every day use those 33 satellites. And if you can see any 3 of them from your phone, I don't mean literally see, but it does the math and figures out where you are on the surface of the Earth. It's provided by the United States Air Force. We do communications, we do missile warning from space. So it is, but it is increasingly a contested environment because we depend on it so much. So I think that everyone would agree that if warfare extends into space, that everybody loses. It is up to us to develop the capability to deter any action against our satellites so that any adversary will choose to deal with our diplomats and not with our warfighters. And that's the objective. We built kind of a glass house in an era before stones. We know that our adversaries are developing the capability to deny us the use of our satellites in crisis or war. And we have to be able to protect those satellites and make sure that doesn't happen.
Last week you were in Europe. You were in Poland, England, a number of other places, I suspect. Talk about alliances and the importance of alliances in today's world.
So as an Air Force officer, I was stationed overseas. I had all of my time as an Air Force officer was overseas, including in the UK, so working with our British allies, and then at the U.S. mission to NATO in Brussels, Belgium. Nations with allies thrive, and those without allies don't. More importantly for us as Americans, countries want to be our allies because we're not practicing the kind of intimidating neo-colonialism that honestly we're seeing, the coercive activity that we're seeing from China with its neighbors or Russia with its neighbors. And it is, so it was fascinating to me to go back to Europe and spend some time in Warsaw, where their highest priority is to deepen, from a national security point of view, is to deepen their alliance with the United States of America. Because they know that their threat comes from the East, and they want to be allied with America. We're stronger when we have allies, and it, you know, in the Middle East and in the war against ISIS, it was 28 nations, I believe, in the air as part of the air alliance, supporting Iraqi indigenous forces and Syrian indigenous forces against ISIS, and none of us can do this alone. It's very evident in space. Nobody can do space situational awareness just from their own countries. We have to work together. And so we're stronger when we do.
Great. So you've had a broad experience, and you've been in the state government, cabinet member in the state government. Of course, as Women Who Inspire, I think it was especially interesting that PhD and international denuclearization or something of great sophistication. And when you were asked to be a cabinet member, it was women, children, youth, and families,
Yeah.
if I recall, something like that. Maybe not exactly relevant to what your background had been.
But my husband and I were foster parents, and we have one adopted son. And so I had seen the child welfare system from the perspective of a parent, a foster parent, and I knew I could make that system better. And so I sold my small business and reformed child welfare in the state of New Mexico. I learned some things from that. One of them is that
Some of them might have helped in Congress.
well, nuclear weapons are safer than teenagers. That's one of the things I learned. Yeah.
In all of what you've done, one of the overlying standards or something that has been persistent is you've been very much involved in science and technology. At your most recent academic setting, you were, as Ambassador Trin Kelly mentioned, you're at the School of Mines and Technology, and at that you had the SURF, the Underground Research Facility, working on subatomic particles and dark matter and things. You're going to, sad for America, sad for the Air Force, but you're going to be going to a Research One university as president. What is it about you and science, and what's the attraction there?
Well, my undergraduate degree from the Air Force Academy, everyone has a Bachelor of Science. And I've always been kind of a polyglot who loved advancing knowledge. But I also think, with respect to women and girls, and we found this at South Dakota Mines, so it's an engineering and science research university, and very similar to UTEP in its origins of engineering and science, practical arts. But one of the things that we still haven't cracked is that still in America's scientific and research programs, only 25% of the students are women. Med school has changed, law school has changed, business has changed, government has changed, but we're still not reaching parity in reaching girls and inspiring them to go into engineering and science. And here's one of the reasons why, and there's pretty good research on this. When you talk, there's an overlap in the middle, but a disproportionate number of boys, teenage boys, are satisfied by solving a problem. A disproportionate number of girls want to know why the problem matters. And so when we talk about engineering in a way that's just about, building a robot, we're talking more to teenage boys than we are to teenage girls. But if I say that if you want to make the water cleaner in your town, if you want to invent the medical device that's going to improve the health of someone you love, if you want to develop the next generation of power plants with zero emissions, then be an engineer. That appeals more across the board to those who want to solve the problems, and they want to know the problem matters. And I don't think we're reaching girls about what being an engineer or scientist really means and how tremendously satisfying it can be to solve problems that matter to people. So I think we need to change the way we talk about engineering and science.
Great. Just final question from me, and we'll open the opportunity for especially students and everyone here. Talk about the Space Force, a big topic, and congressionally mandated direction from that, and a lot of movement, a lot of action has been taking place there. Tell us about the Space Force.
Well, there is a new Space Command that's on the cusp of being stood up. So there used to be a Space Command, a U.S. Space Command, a combatant command before 9/11, and it was disestablished when there was a reorientation of the Defense Department at that time. So the Congress has approved that, and that's going to be stood up. The President has also proposed the establishment of a separate military service underneath the Air Force as a Space Force. So the organized, train, and equip part. That is in front of the Congress this session, and it's something that they're considering as part of the National Defense Authorization Act.
Are there questions from the audience? Might be some topics. I see direction. I think there's a microphone coming your way.
Good evening, and thank you
Hi.
for being here.
Yes, sir.
My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. And my question, I guess, is regarding the folks in the audience who are parents that have daughters. And for those of us who hope to have daughters someday, what can you tell us about yourself that you think personally made you the type of person that men would respect? Being in a position to be able to tell them what to do and to be able to respect it so they'll do the job the right way so you keep your job? What do you-
I think I'm going to make sure you answer this question too. I think a couple of things. One is master your craft. Be the best at whatever you do. And enjoy the company of other craftsmen who surround yourself with people who are good at what they do. Guard your integrity. So you got to call things as you see them. And people will respect you for that. And then you have to work hard. There's sometimes, and I think it's less so now, but certainly early on when women are new at the academy and things, I remember people at the time saying, well, if you're a woman at the Air Force Academy, you have to be twice as good to get half the credit. And I think Sandra Day O'Connor used to say that as well. And at the time, my attitude was, okay, I'll be twice as good. And sometimes life isn't fair. But that doesn't stop us from seeking to achieve. And it teaches us lessons, including the lesson to keep the door open and the ladder clear for everybody else. I would say one other thing for those of you who have daughters. If you look at, and this was also some interesting research about engineers and things, but if you look at successful women in academia, in engineering, in diplomacy, in science, just successful women, and then you compare them to successful men, there are a lot of real similarities. But there's one really big difference. 2/3 of successful men say they've had at least one important mentor in their life. And 2/3 of successful women say they've never had a mentor. As successful women, we need to make sure that we choose to be mentors. And as successful men, you need to make sure you're not just mentoring men. Because some of my most important mentors were men, not women. So we have an obligation to make sure that we are helping the next generation.
I couldn't improve upon that.
Oh,
I
come
think-
on.
I would simply add, be very serious about what you do, but don't take yourself that seriously. Have fun at what you're doing. And I would suggest to you that what you're asking that question suggests you're the kind of gentleman who would be a father, either is or would be a father of a young woman who would find unlimited opportunities. Much was made of the fact that I'm a pilot and have flown some high-performance aircraft, and I was invited at one point to fly an aircraft when women were not permitted to fly fighters or bombers. An admiral who was the father of daughters asked if I'd be willing to train up and do an F-18 landing on an aircraft carrier. And it was because the power was in the hands of the men. It was because that man was going to take care of his daughters and not have artificial barriers in her way or their way that he decided that maybe it was time to stop some artificial barriers and open opportunities to women.
A similar kind of story. So my father and my grandfather were also flyers. My grandfather flew in the First World War and in the Second World War, and it was a barnstormer and things. My dad was killed in a car accident when I was young, but when they opened the Air Force Academy of Women, when I was a junior in high school, my mom said, that you might want to think about that and go talk to your grandfather. So I was terrified of what he was going to say. This was a guy who flown in 2 world wars. I looked up to him tremendously. And I remember even where he was sitting in the living room in their little house when I went and told him I was thinking about this Air Force Academy thing. And he said, well, and because he had two sons, my grandfather did, and 5 grandsons, and me. And so I told him about this, and he got real quiet, and then he said, well, I flew with some women in World War II, the WASPs, and they were pretty good sticks, so I guess that'd be okay. So, it was his experience with women who had opened the doors to just say, it'd be okay. And that was a big deal for a guy born in 1899.
And I would just like to put on the record the fact that Heather Wilson was not only one of the pioneers going to the Air Force Academy when the academies were first opened to women, but then was one of the leaders in opening combat aircraft to women so that women could be, so that we would have, defending America, the best hand-eye coordination, not the best hand-eye coordination of the whole population, not just of 50% of the population. So for that, I think we owe her. Great question, Julian. Thank you. Other questions? Yes. Microphone is coming.
Thank you, Mujtaba with Center for De-Radicalization. A question that has two folds. One is, how can we utilize our Air Force or space capabilities to help humanitarian organizations to have an eye on massacres that are happening in different places? Myanmar is one of them and other places. And two is, and by the way, thank you for being here to inspire all of us. Actually forgot, my stressed out a little bit.
Let me start out with one then. Space capabilities are very routinely used in natural disasters as well as humanitarian disasters. Communications, satellite-based communications are absolutely vital in remote parts of the world. And the other one is Earth observation. So, and sometimes we use, depending on where it is, we'll use manned or unmanned aircraft, but you can also detect, so the same technology that detects infrared from space that looks for missile launches can detect, in some cases, origins of forest fires. Or we can look at, and the Air Force, 10 of our satellites are weather satellites. We do huge amounts of atmospheric science based on data from space. So all of those missions are relevant for both military purposes, but also for humanitarian purposes. Great question.
I remember the second part. How can this struggle that women have gone through within the past years and years be transformed into lessons that minorities in countries that majority-led are oppressing them, transform into lessons that they can learn, although women are not minority in number, but they have been minority in rights. So how can these lessons that women have learned within years, this struggle, be transformed into how minorities in different countries can help themselves to be people who are heard? Thank you.
I think there are obviously similarities. Ambassador Barrett mentioned that I'm leaving the Air Force at the end of May, and then in the fall will become the president of the University of Texas at El Paso. It's a binational, bicultural university where 83% of the students, so it's a class 1 research university, produces more masters and PhDs, Hispanic masters and PhDs in science and engineering than any other university in America, that have mastered the ability to reach students who are first-generation Americans and get them to go to college. And so they have not compromised excellence, they believe that excellence and access go hand in hand, and that we have a responsibility to reach out and keep the doors open for first-generation Americans.
Great. Another question here?
Thank you so much for being here, Secretary Wilson. I actually had the opportunity to work for you for your legislative liaison office under General Basham and General Pletcher. So thank you so much for being here and speaking to us. Two questions, sort of more on a policy note. The first is about rapid acquisition. Obviously, it's been, as you discussed, a huge priority. But you have to get Congress to hand over the keys, and that's one of the hardest parts, is saying, trust me, look what we can do if we work together.
Yeah.
First question, how do you do that? Second question, our strategic deterrent capabilities are aging, and not unlike teenagers, they are a little less dangerous when they get a little older, maybe.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you get something like that off the unfunded priority list and start moving the ball on that very expensive investment?
Yeah.
Thanks.
With respect to the first one, we actually have gotten a lot of, the Congress is with us on acquisition reform, and one of the things they did in 2016 and 2017 is take a lot of the programs that were controlled at the Office of the Secretary of Defense level and push them down to the services. One of the impacts of that, as a service secretary, I have responsibility to, I have the responsibility to get the beans to the barbecue. you know? We've got to get stuff purchased and in the hands of it, because my job is not to run a system or run a program. It is to present a ready, trained force to a combatant commander. OSD staff doesn't have that same motivation. So it's flipped around. 75% of Air Force procurement programs are now run by the Air Force and not by the OSD staff, and that was driven by Congress. With respect to experimentation and prototyping, we're very aggressively using those authorities, but when we started using them, the Assistant Secretary for Acquisition and I said, you know, we have to be even more transparent with these than we are with our other programs. So we went up to the Hill, we said, what is the information you want? We'll give it to you in an understandable way. And now 4 times a year, actually 3 times a year, we give them reports on every single one of our experiments and prototypes. So they have more information about our aggressive programs than they do about the ones that are just done the plain old way. With respect to the nuclear deterrent, our budget both last year and the proposed budget this year fully funds the recapitalization, if you will, of both the ground-based strategic deterrent and the B-52, which is capable of carrying currently the air-launched cruise missile, but we are also developing the replacement for the air-launched cruise missile, which is a long-range standoff weapon. So the safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent is core to what the Air Force does, and it is funded in our budget. It's not on the unfunded list.
Final question? Final question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kirsten. I'm a second-year strategic studies student here. And right now I'm taking a class on Russia, and we recently had a speaker come in and talk about Russia's Air Force in Syria and some of the activities they're doing there. And he mentioned how advanced their Air Force is becoming and how we really need to be watching out for this, and he talked about all the new technologies they have. I'm wondering if you agree with that, just how advanced they're becoming and what your analysis of that situation is, and kind of where our Air Force stacks up with that, because it sounds like what you said earlier, ours is doing just fine as well. So.
Well, we are modernizing our Air Force. If we had a fight today, I'd rather be us than them. And that's particularly true with the F-22 and the F-35. But let's talk a little bit about Syrian airspace, because I think this is one of those things that you really don't think about in the fight against ISIS in Syria, and how complicated that airspace is. In most circumstances, if we were in a fight, the Air Force would go in, we'd take down the air defenses, we would secure air dominance as we have. And one little factoid here, the last time an American soldier or Marine was killed on the ground by enemy aircraft was April 15th, 1953. So when Americans on the ground hear jet noise, they don't have to look up because they know it's us. And their fathers knew it was us. So we are dominant. We would normally go in completely cleared out and be dominant. Well, we don't have that situation in Syria. We have the Syrians, we have the Russians, we have the United States and 28 allies, all within shooting distance of each other, with pilots' average age of about 24. So there are circumstances where we have had an American air cap over coalition forces on the ground being watched by a Russian aircraft, and the Russians didn't know it, but an F-22 watching them. And everybody just saying, you know, mind your P's and Q's. What's also fascinating about that circumstance is that we have a direct open line between the Air Operations Center and the Russian center in Syria, with 5 airmen who were all, two of them I talked to, they are native Russian speakers who emigrated to America and are now American airmen. And their job is to deconflict airspace and to make sure that there's no miscalculation among adversaries who are within range of each other. It's a fascinating example of how air forces work together and deconflict situations and try to de-escalate in a very complicated part of the world. But it's not the way we would normally operate. But if there were a fight today, I'm actually not as worried about the Russians because, you know, in some ways they're a petropower that's nuclear armed and in decline. What I really worry about more is not today, but 2030 and beyond with respect to China and the capabilities they're either stealing and developing or developing on their own.
Ladies and gentlemen, aren't we lucky as in America and for peace in the world that we've had Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, in that leadership. And I'm going to take a moment of point of personal privilege because now many of you here are SICE regulars, so you know the incomparable John McLaughlin, who's joined us this afternoon. Would you join me in saluting one of the very Maybe not so regular in your audience is another special guest who's here, and that's Tina Jonas, who at the time, as Women Who Inspire, at the time of her leadership as the Undersecretary of Defense, I hope I get this right because I didn't intend to do this, but as Undersecretary of Defense and Comptroller, with a background also on the Hill, but she was at that time the top-ranking woman ever in the Pentagon. I'm inspired. I hope you are too. And a final comment is that today on this stage, you've heard from, in my view, the incomparable, extraordinary, one-of-a-kind leader, Condoleezza Rice. And then we heard from an extraordinary woman leader, Ana Palacio, who was the first woman to be foreign minister of Spain, and beyond that, a great leader in the European Union, and a regular of Washington, D.C., and a force of nature in herself, Ana Palacio, Condoleezza Rice, Ana Palacio, now Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson. All of that has happened because of SICE's special agent, Ambassador Sharon Tahir-Kelly. Would you join me in congratulating her? And with that, I think our afternoon is concluded. Thank you very much for being here. Yeah, women inspire on time, right? Thank you. You're the best.